The movie's prologue features footage of a real-life disaster that occurred on the night of January 15, 1905. The debris from an unstable mountain fell into the river in Lodeland, Norway. The resulting flood wave was 40 meters high and claimed the lives of 65 people. Just a few years later, a huge boulder tumbled into a lake below in Sunmore. This time the resulting flood wave killed 40 people. As the movie shifts from one narrator to the next, it warns that Norway has over 300 unstable mountains, and so it's only a matter of time before the next big calamity happens. The prologue sets the scene by predicting the next disaster in Geiranger, a town that is under constant threat of annihilation should a landslide occur in Mountain Okernset, into the fjord. A man is shown driving through a highway that cuts through mountainous vistas. He eventually parks his car on a ferry headed for Geiranger. As Christian pulls up into his driveway, he comes home to his wife, Iden, fixing the kitchen sink. Despite his insistence, his wife assures him they do not need a plumber. While the two banter, we're introduced to Christian's daughter and son, Julia and Sandra. At the dinner table, Christian excitedly tells his family the features of their new home, one they're going to move into very soon. Later, Christian asks Iden if he should throw away a few shirts as they're beginning a new life. Iden teases him at the suggestion and the two share an intimate moment. However, they're interrupted by Sandra, who suggests they should get off the kitchen counter. It's revealed that Christian is a geologist who works at an early warning center monitoring the landslide risk of Mount Okernset. He steps into his office to place his bag and heads into a monitoring room. Fortunately, there's no sign of a landslide today as the numbers have been in the acceptable range. Soon enough, work is over and Christian is thrown a farewell party by his colleagues. He's moving away from the town of Geiranger to work for an oil company further up the mountains, in Stavanger. As Christian is packing, he notices some noise coming from the monitoring room. Concerned, Christian decides to investigate. To his dismay, all his co-workers are huddled in the room together as they try to make sense of the fluctuating numbers. Groundwater has seemingly vanished at some points. Despite the numbers saying otherwise, everything on the ground seems stable. As Christian suspects the worst, he's snapped back to reality by his supervisor. He tells him to go home and not to worry about it. Back at his place, Christian is still hung up on the numbers when his wife tells him to help with the packing so they can move away tomorrow. As Christian goes outside to throw away a box full of files, he sees his son sitting by the riverside. He sits by his side and Sandra tells him that he's gotten used to this town. Christian explains that Iden and him did what they thought best for the family. Sandra posits that they can't keep running away as the entire country is made of stone. As the family's done packing, the neighbors drop in to say goodbye. Iden tells them that Christian and the kids will be going on ahead while she will be joining them later as she still has work to take care of. Soon enough, Christian and the kids drive away to hop onto the ferry that will take them to their new home. As Christian watches his son play a game on his phone, he begins pondering. Next, he notices the water leaking through some rocks. He reaches a realization and immediately turns the car around to go back to his office. His co-workers are surprised to see him back and even more caught off guard when he tells them he wants to show them something. Meanwhile, Iden bikes her way to work at the Geiranger Hotel. She changes into her uniform and joins her friend Vibeke at the reception desk. As Iden prepares to service several new guests, Vibeke asks her about her family. Iden tells her that they should be on the way to the ferry. Back at the early warning center, Christian's colleagues are concerned for his well-being as he rages on about his concerns. He explains that although the numbers suggest that the groundwater vanished, he doesn't believe the events unfolded that way. He believes that the water shifted between the rock layers, causing them to displace, which in turn collapsed the cables. If this is true, the worst-case scenario could realize, decimating Geiranger. His co-workers, although a bit skeptical, know that they can't just dismiss his claims. What follows is a shot of a chopper flying through the mountains with Christian at the helm. As the chopper reaches the control station, Christian and his co-worker prepare to trek down the mountains to inspect the cables. Meanwhile, Iden receives a call from the kids who were waiting outside the early warning center all this time. Lo and behold, Christian was right and the cables did in fact collapse. Back at the early warning center, Christian's supervisor explains that before any drastic maneuvers, they will investigate further and surveil the mountain on a round-the-clock basis. This upsets Christian, who lashes out. As he gathers himself and goes outside, he finds a note stuck to the windshield wipers of the car. "We're not waiting here, ring Mom." Christian knows he screwed up. As he steps into the hotel lobby, Aiden rips into him. Christian admits his mistake and they both realize that the family will have to wait till tomorrow to move to Stavanger. Aiden tells the kids that they can spend the night at the hotel, but Julia wants to say one final goodbye to their home. Christian decides to entertain her wish and the two step outside while Sandra stays behind with Aiden. Christian and Julia arrive at their old home and search the trash for a mattress and a chair so they can sleep at night. Meanwhile, Aiden shows Sandra to his room. After tucking Julia in for the night, Christian opens the bottle his co-workers gifted him and sends a message to Aiden apologizing for his behavior. Aiden schemes through his message as she reads a disaster guide. Back at the control station, both Arvid and Jacob rue the circumstances in which they had to say goodbye to Christian. However, Arvid is hopeful that he'll eventually find his way back to them. "Once the mountains get a hold of you, they won't let you go," he says to Jacob. The latter can only laugh. At the hotel, Sandra grows increasingly bored in his room and decides to go down into the basement. Once there, he puts his headphones on and begins to skate to the tunes. The camera pans through a shot of the monitoring room at the early warning center. As Mikhail comes across some concerning readings, he wakes up Margot and they get into contact with Arvid and Jacob at the control station. Once they explain that it seems like the mountain has been pulled together, Arvid grows concerned and takes it upon himself and Jacob to investigate. Once they're down there, they confirm that the contraction readings were in fact true. Jacob volunteers to take another reading and detaches himself from his tether. Christian calls the early warning center just to check up on how things are holding up. Margot explains the situation to him, but once she mentions contractions, a light bulb goes off in Christian's head. He begins frantically searching the trash for his old files when he notices a flock of birds flying overhead, signing the coming of something ominous. Christian confirms that at two previous sites rock contractions were a precursor to landslides. He immediately calls Margot to warn Arvid and Jacob, but alas, he's too late. An earthquake lodges a large boulder at Jacob's foot and he becomes stuck. As things go from bad to worse, Margot sounds the alarm to alert the town. Back in the crevice, Arvid sacrifices himself and attaches his tether to Jacob instead, explaining that it's not strong enough to hold both of them. As the landslide initiates, Arvid goes hurtling down with it. As the rock mass meets the body of water underneath, a terrifyingly large wave begins to form. In the monitoring room, a timer starts going off, indicating 10 minutes before the wave reaches Geiranger. As his worst fears come true, Christian puts a timer of 10 minutes on his watch and runs out with Julia to his jeep. Back at the hotel, Aiden tells Vibike they have 10 minutes to get everyone out of their rooms and into the bus. Despite the chaos, Christian manages to get into contact with Aiden, who tells him that he must get Julia and himself to safety, rather than get into contact with her and Sandra. Christian hesitantly agrees and continues driving up the mountain. As he comes across a roadblock, Christian gets out of his car to start running uphill. He also tells everyone stranded on the road to start doing the same, including his neighbors. Unfortunately, Anna, his neighbor's wife, becomes stuck between two cars. Realizing he should step to the occasion, Christian leaves Julia in the care of his neighbor and helps get Anna unstuck. However, the wave is already within their sight, and since they're pinched for time, Anna and Christian take refuge in a car. Back at the hotel, Aiden can't locate Sandra, and although the bus is ready to leave, Aiden tells Vibike she can't leave without her son. A couple, Maria and Philip, from earlier in the film whom Aiden tended to at the reception, join in on Aiden's suicidal pursuit. The three eventually find Sandra in the basement, unaware of all the chaos upstairs. They rush outside but find that the wave is already within kill range. Aiden remembers that there are shelters in the basement, and so that's where the four start running back to. They do manage to reach the shelter, but not before Maria is swept away by the raging waters. After the wave subsides, Christian wakes up to a dead Anna in the passenger seat. Though shocked, he pulls himself together and climbs out of the car from the back window. It takes a moment for Christian to take in everything around him, but once he does, he starts looking for Julia. At the monitoring station, Margot receives a call from Jacob who breaks the news of Arvid's death to the team. Before long, Christian comes across a group of survivors and begins shouting out Julia's name. To his delight, Julia is alive and well, and so is his neighbor. As he hugs Julia, he locks eyes with his neighbor who understands that his wife is dead when he sees Christian's eyes. After the reunion, Christian begins calling to investigate the whereabouts of the tourist bus Aiden and Sandra were supposed to be in. When he doesn't get a lead, he decides he will go looking for it himself. Back at the shelter, Aiden turns on the auxiliary power and then tries opening the door. However, the corridor outside is still fully flooded and the water starts making its way into the shelter. Aiden somehow manages to close the door again. She then begins looking for another way outside as Philip grows increasingly unstable. Aiden then locates a vent inside the room but realizes it's too cramped for an adult when she climbs inside. Unfortunately, water breaks through a crack in the closed door and begins making its way into the shelter. Aiden, Sandra, and Philip realize it's only a matter of time before they're fully submerged. As Christian rows a boat through the death and destruction, he eventually reaches land. He then successfully locates the tourist bus but finds that everyone inside is dead. Unable to find Aiden and Sandra, he gathers they might still be at the hotel and makes his way toward it. The shelter is now fully flooded, and although the three locked inside try to open the door, they're unable to, as the debris on the outside blocks it. Both Aiden and Sandra come up to vent to breathe and are soon joined by an unstable Philip. In his panic, Philip starts pushing both Aiden and Sandra down in order to breathe. Despite telling him to calm down several times, Aiden takes a drastic step in a moment of desperation. She kills Philip by locking her legs around his head. At the same time, Christian arrives at the hotel lobby and locates Sandra's backpack. Thinking his wife and son are dead, he begins furiously banging a pipe against the metal columns. Still reeling from Philip's death, Aiden and Sandra hear the sound from Christian's pipe and begin making sounds of their own to signal for help. Fortunately, Christian listens and swims his way to the shelter. He moves away the debris blocking the door and opens it to find Aiden. He then guides her to safety outside and then goes in for Sandra, who's understandably a bit shaken. As the two swim toward safety, Sandra loses his breath and Christian has to kiss him to lend him some of his air. Sandra successfully swims outside, but Christian is left stranded as he has no air in his lungs to continue. He's saved by Aiden but is unresponsive. Sandra and his mother then try their best to resuscitate Christian and succeed against all odds. Towards the movie's end, Julia is reunited with her family as the three step outside a rescue helicopter.